I'd like to introduce our second speaker for today, Dr. Karl Szpunar from the Toronto Metropolitan University, where he directs the Memory Lab. The Memory Lab conducts research that elucidates the cognitive and neural mechanisms supporting functional uses of memory in daily life. Topics of interest include the role of memory in learning and futurist thinking. And specifically, the Memory Lab is currently carrying out research that aims to, one, help learners overcome the limits of attention and memory in traditional educational settings. Um, Two, understand the role of memory in giving rise to spontaneous mental stimulations of future events and their impact on behavior and well-being. And finally, three, to understand how memory and future thinking in young and older adults can impact the future of society. And a little well-known fact about Karl, in his spare time, he really likes to enjoy doing even more education and cognition research.
All right, Joe. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And not just thanks to you, but to members of the organizing committee, Michelle, Katie, Paulina, Irina, and everybody who makes this great event possible. It's just really nice being able to hear about educationally relevant research in all various domains and thinking about how what we're doing might tie into those domains as well. So I've really appreciated everything that I've been learning today. And so what I'd like to do with the time that I have with you all today is to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing where we are trying to apply the science of learning to unconstrained virtual environments. And the perspective I'm going to take for this talk is to give you a bit of a historical overview of how we've gone from doing very basic laboratory research focused on understanding mechanisms of why certain things improve learning and memory, and then how we've grown in that work and started to move towards more ecologically valid materials, and then try to take that work to more ecologically valid settings. And just to give you a sense of how a cognitive psychologist can start from very, very basic research and move their way up to doing things that might potentially make some difference in the real world. And before I do that, I just want to, while I know I have time, I just want to make sure to acknowledge all the folks who have made the work that I'm going to tell you about today possible. So everyone up here, you're going to hear about some of the work that they've been involved with at one point or another. And then also to the funding agencies who definitely make the work that we do possible. Okay, so I guess there's really 5 things that I'm going to go over in the talk today. I'm going to start out by highlighting a common obstacle learning that we took a particular interest in, right? So the work that we've been doing has been very focused on one obstacle learning that we think applies to many different settings. Then I'm going to tell you about something that we call interpolated retrieval practice. So you've heard a lot about retrieval practice, about how retrieving things from memory can help us to retain those things for long periods of time. Interpolated retrieval practice is a little bit different. We can use testing to help people learn information that comes after a test better than they would. And I'm going to tell you about how this might help us overcome the obstacle that we've taken an interest in. And then I'm going to tell you of how, from that basic work, we've started to move to more ecologically valid materials like video recorded lectures, unconstrained virtual environments, and then I'll leave you with some thoughts about future directions that we're going to be, or that we are thinking about in our own work. Okay, all right, so common obstacle to learning. I think the timing of this talk in today's session is pretty good to give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about here. At some point during this talk, you're going to experience this obstacle. And it's not just here. So if you're learning a lecture in a remote setting or an in-person setting, you're going to experience this obstacle. If you're reading, you're going to experience this obstacle. If you're sort of going through as many articles as you can for a course or for a paper that you want to write, you're going to experience this obstacle. If you're studying for an exam, you're going to encounter this obstacle. Even if you're someone outside of academia in what my wife typically will say is the real world, if you are someone who is involved in onboarding new staff, usually there's a lot of information they have to learn pretty quickly. They're going to experience these obstacles. And that basically is that when we learn, it takes time. And whether it's a lecture or a paper we're reading, you start the process of learning that particular piece of information. And that as time progresses, at some point you're going to feel something that I think came up in Vanessa's talk, information overload. It just feels like I've taken in so much information that things feel like they're just bouncing off of my mind. I can't take in anymore. And when you speak to students in classroom settings, at the start of the lecture, they're doing great. When you get to the end of the lecture, the common sort of feeling is like, can we just be done with this? There's only so much that I can take in. And what I want to convince you of today is that time really has not very much to do with it. What happens is that there are things that are happening over time that are giving rise to this type of experience. And what we want to know is how can we address this and how can we improve how well students or employees or whoever is learning, not just at the beginning of a study episode, but towards the end of that study episode. How can we maintain a high level of learning throughout? And I'm going to mention two different things throughout the course of this talk. The first one I'm going to tell you about is something we call proactive interference. And all this is that when you start at the outset of a learning episode, again, it feels like everything you're digesting things, it's coming in. As you progress, you get this sort of mental experience of, oh, I feel like I can't take in anything else. And one thing that we know from the learning sciences literature is that over time, that information that you learned at the very outset of the study episode, it's coming forward and interfering with your ability to take in new information, okay? And so the first thing that I want to really do in today's talk is to sort of take you back to some of the early work that we were doing, where we were seeing this in our research, and it really got us thinking about this seems to be a bit of a problem, and is there anything that we can do to help students maintain a high level of performance throughout a learning episode, okay? So this goes back about 15 years. And again, I'll sort of just naturally progress with what we've been doing here. The initial work that we did around this involved what we call a multi-list learning paradigm, where all that means is that students come into a laboratory setting and they learn multiple lists of words, okay? A lot of memory research works this way. So for instance, a student might come into the lab and they'll get a list of 18 words that we want them to commit to memory, but they won't see it all 18 words at a time. So for those of you who are not cognitive psychologists, the way that this would look for a participant is they're sitting in front of a computer screen, focusing on that fixation cross, and then every few seconds they're going to see a word appear on the screen. And they're told that at some point, you're going to be having to tell us what you've learned here, okay? So we won't go through the whole list, but you get the idea of how this works. Once they get through that first list, they might engage in some sort of distractor activity just to get their mind off of the task, and then they're presented with a second list of 18 words. And they go through that same process, they learn this list, then they engage in some distractor activity, and the same thing happens for lists 3, 4, and 5. So now you've been exposed to 90 words across all 5 lists. And before the student leaves the experiment, we tell them, oh, there's going to be a final cumulative test, and we want you now to tell us everything that you've learned while you've been here with us today. So you've been exposed to 90 words. Whatever order they come to mind, just try to tell us everything that you learned. And what we saw in our data, and what many others see in their data, is something that looks like this. So when we look at their recall protocol and we backsort it based on what list each word came from, what we find is that individuals, yeah, you can sort of see it there. The first list they learn pretty well, and as they progress through the study sequence, they're not doing quite as well, right? And it's sort of reflective of this common experience that students have in classroom settings, that as I sort of progress, it seems to be harder to take in new information. Well, it turns out that how you structure the learning experience matters in terms of whether or not you see this pattern. And so what I'm going to tell you about is another condition that we had in this study where we did something, it was a minor change, but the pattern of data that we got was dramatically different. So again, it's 5 lists of words, and you see the first list of words. But this time, before you go on to the next list, we asked participants, can you just tell me all the words you learned just from that first list that you were exposed to? Then they get the second list of words, And then again, we give them a test. And this time we say, for that second list that you were just exposed to, just tell us all the words that you remember, and then we'll move on. And then the same thing happens for list 3, 4, and 5. And then just like the other group of participants, at the very end of the study, we tell them, oh, and there's also a final cumulative test. And now we want you to think about everything that you had learned and try to recall as much of the 90 words as you can, whatever order they come to mind, it doesn't matter. So let's see what those data look like, right? So here again, you're seeing the data I showed you before for that non-tested group where they're doing some sort of distractor activity between lists. And what happens when we had been testing people between lists on that final cumulative test? And what it looks like is something like this, right? And now you see that here again, both groups are learning that first set of stimuli relatively well, but then as you advance down the study sequence, you see that if we had been testing you throughout, you are remembering the information that came later much better. And the thing that we were really interested in was this fifth and final list, right? So we're interested in the end of study sequences, right? This common experience that students will report to us that when I get to the end of the lecture, I just can't take in anything else. So why are we seeing this pattern, right? One idea that we have is that maybe there's something about the fact that we're testing you during the study sequence that's helping to sustain a high level of learning. But based on this initial experiment, we couldn't say that definitively because for that fifth and final list, there was a difference between the conditions. One had been tested, one had not been tested. And so this is performance on that final cumulative test. So what this could simply reflect is a testing effect. That this is something we know that if you've been tested on something, you're going to retain it better. And it's not anything to do with this idea that if we're testing you throughout, that you're going to be learning something new better later on. And so we wanted to tease that apart in some work that we did later on. And so again, so this is sort of leading us to this idea of interpolated retrieval practice that perhaps over an extended study sequence, if we test people throughout, then we can maintain a high level of learning during the actual study episode. And we wanted to, again, just try to demonstrate that a little more definitively. Okay, and so I'll just quickly tell you about how we did that, and then we'll move on to some of the more ecologically valid work that we've been doing. And so in order to do this, we again adopted this multi-list learning paradigm. And again, we had our tested and non-tested groups, but now we did something just a little bit different. For the tested group, again, they're getting lists of 18 words per list. For the tested group, we test them after each list. For the non-tested group, they don't get tests until they get to the fifth and final list. And then for that fifth and final list, we test them. What we wanted to see is that depending on whether or not we had been testing you on the first 4 segments of the learning experience, when you get to that fifth and final segment, if we've been testing you, are you going to be learning that information initially better than if you had not been tested previously, right? And so if we do it this way, we don't have any confound with retroactive effects of testing. This would be more of an interpolated forward testing effect, sometimes is what it's called. And then we also did one other thing to try to address another potential confound in this design, and that is that let's say we see that if we've been testing you throughout the study sequence and you're doing better, are you doing better because you've been tested, or are you doing better because when you're being tested, you're effectively just re-exposing yourself to the material. You have more experience with it. And so we actually added one additional condition where during the first 4 segments of the study sequence, they were just, after they studied the list once, they studied it again in a new random order. And they did that for each of the first 4 lists, but again, they were tested on that fifth and final list. And the reason why this condition was important is that if we compare the tested to the non-tested group, if the tested group is doing better, and this has something to do with simply just being re-exposed to the materials when you're being tested, then that restudy group, if anything, should do as well as the tested group, or perhaps even better, because when people are tested, they're not recalling the entire list, whereas the restudy group is re-exposed to everything. So if anything, that group should be as good or better than the tested group. But if this has something to do with the fact that you've engaged in retrieval practice throughout the study sequence, then that tested group should do better than the non-tested and the restudy group. Okay? And so I'll just show you what those data look like. So again, we're looking at that fifth and final segment of the study sequence. For correct recall, what we see is that if you're being tested on those first 4 segments, you learn that 5th and final segment really well, and that it does seem to have something to do with the fact that you've engaged in retrieval practice, because that restudy group is no different than the non-tested group. And then earlier I mentioned this idea of proactive interference, that when we're learning over time, the initial information can interfere with our ability to learn new information. So there you see prior list intrusions. Remember, for that 5th list, they're told, we just want you to remember what happened on that 5th list. Everything else is irrelevant. Prior list intrusions are words that they recall on that test that come from the first 4 lists. And that's what that looks like. If we're testing you throughout the study sequence, you're doing a very good job of honing in on the information that's relevant, whereas if we haven't done that, it's very hard to distinguish where this information is coming from. Okay? Okay. And so this pattern of data, or these benefits of interpolated testing, have been demonstrated now in dozens of studies. It generalizes to different types of materials, so not just word lists. It's been shown with young children, older adults, college students. It's been shown with individuals with traumatic brain injuries or frontal lobe damage, participants who might have particular difficulties warding off interference during learning. And in our own work, what we've sort of tried to do as we move forward is, now that we have a good sense of what's going on in these tightly controlled experimental settings with very tightly controlled stimuli, is this going to work when we sort of move on to materials that might be much more relevant to what students are learning in the real world? And so for us, video recorded lectures was a natural place to go. We started moving to video recorded lectures back in about, I want to say 2012, 2013. And the reason why that year was significant is that was around when massive open online courses became like all the rage. And everyone was thinking, now we're really going to go virtual with everything. And so we thought, well, this is perfect. This might be a nice set of materials that we can start to use. Now, the important thing I'm going to mention here is we're still doing this in a laboratory setting, but just with more ecologically valid materials. Okay. Now, whenever I get to this part of the talk, I always show this image. I think I gave a talk at EdCog probably like 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm pretty sure I might have shown this image back then too. But even when I teach about this in my classes, I show this image. For me, this represents, and maybe for some of you as well, what I one day dream about walking in on when I teach my courses, where everyone is just engaged and eager and ready to go. We all know that this image doesn't exist in the real world. The only place this exists is on our institutional websites, where here's our mission statement and here's what our university is doing for our students, and you'll see pictures like this. But you walk into any classroom in any university, anywhere in the world, and you're not going to see this. And we all know why, right? We know why that's the case, because there's a lot of obstacles to learning outside of what I'm talking about today, the very specific thing that we've been interested in. But let's just imagine for a moment that this, one day you walked in and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is great. What if we were to sample the contents of the thoughts of these students, okay? So what if we look at the student in the second row, and in that moment we say, hey, by the way, what are you thinking about right now? That student might say something like, oh, this lecture is so interesting and engaging, and again, those are the things we really want to hear. But what about this person here in the front row, right? It looks like they're very engaged, and if we say, what are you thinking about right now? Their thoughts might have absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in the world around them. And this phenomenon of our mind sort of drifting to things that are unrelated to what we're doing is called mind wandering. This is something that we are all intimately familiar with. I am certain that if you haven't already, and if you're not experiencing it yet right now, at some point during this 40-minute talk, you will experience this phenomenon. Actually, Andy's talk yesterday made me think quite a lot about these not about the fact how much I was mind wandering during Andy's talk, but goal conflicts, where is there something else I'd like to be doing other than what I'm doing right now? I wonder if these types of conflicts give rise to these types of experiences, especially in educational settings. So there's a very good reason why I made that connection. But in educational settings, we know there's an abundance of research showing that when we mind wander, it is absolutely terrible for performance, right? And it makes sense. If we're mind wandering, especially in a way that's unrelated to the content of the lecture, there's no way you're encoding that information in any meaningful way. And again, it sort of comes back to this idea. So I've talked about proactive interference. There's more work showing that over time, our minds just tend to wander. And so because we were starting to shift over to more ecologically valid materials, we also wanted to think about this more ecologically relevant obstacle to learning that occurs over time, or what we call mind wandering. And is there something that we can do about that? Okay, so at the time, at least in cognitive psychology, there wasn't as much work with video recorded materials, and now more and more we're seeing quite a bit of it, especially with what happened with the rise of COVID and moving to virtual environments. And I'll come back to that later on. But when we were starting out, there was a lot of choices we could have made about where to start, and one of those was, well, what kind of material are we going to use? And so what we did is we surveyed students on campus, and we basically asked them, can you tell us what course is the one that you it is hard to take in the information for you, you find yourself not being able to focus, and I've already given it away. And my heart goes out to those of you who teach statistics, because we all know how difficult it can be to do that, right? Especially when we have psychology students and they're taking abnormal psychology and social psychology courses, and there's so much content there that you can relate to your own life. Statistics is a little abstract, and it's very hard sometimes to get people to think about how is this relevant to me? And so we thought, well, what better place to start than with statistics? The other reason we really wanted to tackle this is because even though students complain about stats more so than their other courses, I'm willing to bet that what they learn in their stats courses is going to be far more important once they leave their university than anything else they're learning in their other psych courses. And so, again, a second reason why we thought stats might be the good place to go. And so what we did is we took a 20-minute intro to statistics lecture that was developed by the Department of Economics at Harvard University. And we adapted it to our interpolated testing paradigm. So we broke the video up into 4 5-minute segments. And again, just like with the work we had been doing with our word lists, we had 3 groups of participants: the tested, non-tested, the restudy group. And again, the critical thing that we were going to be looking at is whether or not we're testing you after those first 3 segments of the lecture. When you get to that 4th and final segment, how well are you learning it based on whether or not you've been tested? And then one additional thing that we did is at one random point during each segment of the lecture, we asked our participants, by the way, what are you thinking about right now? Were you mind wandering, or were you paying attention to the lecture? And before the study started, we made sure they understood what we meant by that. Of course, everyone knows what we mean by that. And so again, one random point during each segment of the lecture, we're asking participants, what were you thinking about right now? And we wanted to see, if we're testing you, are we in any way helping you to stay a little more focused on the content of learning than you would be otherwise? Okay. So in terms of the learning outcomes, and this is the stuff that we really care about, when we looked at that 4th and final segment, we see that the group that had been tested on the first 3 segments of the video, there's about a 20 to 25% benefit in terms of how well they're learning that 4th and final segment. In case you're curious, for each segment, if you're being tested, there's 6 questions that we're asking you, and so this is an average of how well they're responding to those 6 questions from the lecture. And again, we see there's no difference between that non-tested and restudy group. For the mind wandering, what we found is that if we're not testing you during this lecture, 40% of the time, they're mind wandering, right? And we found this to be rather interesting because in these studies, they're in an experimental room. The experimenter is often in the room with them. They know they're going to be checked on their attention, and still 40% of the time, they, and their responses was, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I was thinking about what maybe half of you in this room are thinking about right now, lunch, right? I'm thinking about what I'm going to be eating later on, and I just couldn't help it. My mind just sort of drifted off to that. But if we tested people throughout the lecture, we were able to drop that in half to about 20%. And there was a nice relationship between attention and learning. The more you were focused, the better you were learning. Okay. And then this pattern of data we've replicated in different studies, not just with undergraduates, but with high school students as well. And, I sort of mentioned earlier that one of the limits of what we've done is that we're still in a laboratory setting. They're watching the video, they're more ecologically valid materials, but it's still in a laboratory setting. So what's going to happen when we go into a more unconstrained environment? Are we still going to see this benefit? And there were two reasons why we were sort of eager to figure this out. One was that when we initially started publishing some of this work, it would get some attention, and we were really excited about that. But then the more attention it got, the more we started to worry, because we were like, we haven't actually demonstrated that this is going to help with the development of actual educational videos. So when you look at guidelines for here's things you should be doing in developing effective educational videos, and you have like, here's the top 5 things, interpolated retrieval practice will show up on that list. When you look at guidelines for developing effective massive open online courses, interpolated retrieval practice will show up on that list. Hey, here's something everybody should be doing, and here's a few studies that are telling you why. When you look at guidelines for here's the most effective way to flip your classroom, if you're going to be recording your lectures and using your classroom time for more effective purposes, for those videos, interpolated retrieval practice, here's some shooting. And so again, we were really excited about that, but we're like, well, we haven't actually shown that this is going to work in these more unconstrained environments. We've only done this in laboratory settings, so maybe we should start to do that. The other thing that really got us up and going with this is with the onset of COVID. And then all of a sudden, it's not just we need to do this, but I think everyone in this room who was carrying out research, the only way to do it was to do it in unconstrained virtual environments. Right? Now our students are doing the work from the comfort of their own home, right? And you think about what is a student doing in a lab as they're performing a task, and then think about what is a student doing when they're performing that same task in the comfort of their own home. What's the best case scenario, and what's the worst case scenario, right? There's probably other people in the room. The time of day that they're completing this might be very different than what you imagine. There might be other media that they're being exposed to at the same time. And so there's a lot of other factors that might be grabbing their attention or what have you. And what we're showing that we can keep people engaged and maintain a high level of learning when we go into these unconstrained environments, are we going to find that same pattern of data? And what I'm going to show you is the answer is yes and no. Again, if at any point anyone has any thoughts, criticisms, advice, I'd love to hear it. So the last 2 studies that I'm going to tell you about are things that we've just carried out at TMU. And the goal was not just to go to these unconstrained environments, but also to push the generalizability of what we've been finding. In the first study, I'm going to tell you about, we manipulated lecture content, so we're sort of moving away just from statistics, and also the types of tests we're giving participants. We often give cued recall tests. What if we give multiple choice tests, right? If you want to implement this in your own classrooms, multiple choice tests are often easier to develop and implement than cued recall, and they're easier to score, but will they work as well? So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then in the second study, we've also been interested in sort of pushing the limits of individual differences in our participants. And in particular, we know this works with students who come into our classes where we're not interested in individual differences necessarily, where we're not, that's not the goal of what we're looking at. But what if we take students who might have particular difficulties in sustaining attention for long periods of time or learning for long periods of time? Are we going to see these benefits as well? And so in that second study, we looked at ADHD symptomatology as an index of that. So yeah, let me just tell you a little bit about the first study. So here Again, we're adopting this interpolated testing paradigm, 20-minute videos, 4 or 5-minute segments. How well are you learning towards the end of that prolonged sequence of learning, right? The place where we know people have difficulties maintaining a high level of performance. The only difference is we've dropped that non-tested group now. And the reason for that is the non-tested and restudy groups in every study we've ever run, it's the same pattern of data. And so we just retained the restudy group because it does a better job of controlling for what's going on in the tested group. But ultimately, I don't think it matters. And for this particular study, we had 242 TMU undergraduates. I don't have any individual difference information here, but I can assure you our TMU students are a rather diverse population that is representative of the Greater Toronto area, which really helps with a lot of work we do and what we can say about it. This time we used that same statistics lecture that we used before, now just because we wanted to see if we now take this to an unconstrained environment, are we going to see the same pattern of data? And then we took a second lecture, also from psychology. This is Intro to Personality. It's a lecture developed by John Gabrielli at MIT that's freely available online. And we're able to sort of adapt it for our purposes. And we also, as I sort of alluded to before, we manipulated whether we're using cued recall tests or multiple choice tests. I'm not going to go into all the details of the matrix of all the different ways we manipulated this. But if anyone has any questions later on, I will let you know. But I'll give you like sort of just the general takeaway of whether it's working with one type of testing or another. And so I'm just going to show you what the data from this study look like. With the learning data, I'm going to collapse everything across different lectures or across different testing types because it didn't actually matter that much. And again, what we're finding is that if we've been testing you on the first 3 segments of the lecture, when you get to the end of the study sequence where you're going to have problems performing well, you're doing better if we've been testing you before, okay? Again, didn't matter if it was stats or personality. The one thing I will say is that it does seem to be more effective with cued recall than multiple choice testing. You still see the same pattern with multiple choice testing, it's just not as pronounced with cued recall. But that might also depend on the quality of multiple choice questions that you're developing, and maybe the ones we developed weren't as effective as they could have been. In terms of attention, this is where what we've been finding has been getting us to think quite a bit more. There's a trend towards testing might be doing something with attention, but it's in no way reliable, right? So when we look at that restudy group, it's the same thing we saw in the laboratory setting. 40% of the time, now participants are getting prompts on the computer screen to respond to, were you paying attention, were you not paying attention? And again, 40% of the time they'll say, like, I was thinking about something else. And in fact, we get them to tell us, what else were you sort of thinking about? For the tested group, we can't really get them off of this 40%. And the one reason why we think this is happening is, again, it's a very unconstrained environment where we have no idea what is going on around this individual as they're learning this from the comfort of their own home. And in this work, attention is still related to learning in some way, but it's not everything. Because even though we it's okay, it's not working. Even though we can't get attention sort of back towards the lecture, that learning benefit is still coming out. So there's still something else that's giving us that benefit over time. So even in these unconstrained settings where people might be especially distracted and it's a little bit harder for us to get them back on task, that benefit of interpolated testing is still there, right? And so maybe that has something to do with warding off proactive interference, which in this pattern of data, we also see that it's doing that. And there's other factors that we know are at work. And so if anyone has any questions about that later, I'll be happy to sort of get into the weeds of all the different reasons we think this works. But the reason why we were particularly excited about this is that even though the attention stuff is looking a little bit different, the learning outcome is still there. And that's the thing that we really care about. And then the last thing I'll discuss is sort of some work that Himjot Gill, who's a current clinical graduate student in our lab, became interested in was, well, what about students who might really need some assistance with sustaining their attention and learning over extended periods of time? And so again, we have the same interpolated testing paradigm. So we've really gotten as much as we could out of this paradigm over the last 10, 15 years, and it keeps giving back, and so we go back. We had 144 TMU undergraduates. Here we just used the statistics lecture, stuck with queued recall just because our earlier work was showing that queued recall was working better. But again, that could be due to the quality of the multiple choice questions we had developed. And then each student filled out a measure of ADHD symptomatology. Okay? And I'm not going to go into too much details rather than just sort of showing you the overall pattern of results. And I will make one point about sort of the ADHD symptomatology measure we measure, because there's something that came out of that for us was rather striking. The first thing I'm just going to show you is that across all participants, interpolated testing, again, you get to that fourth and final segment of lecture, it's sustaining a higher level of learning than if you're not being tested, which is good. Again, with attention, we can't get it off that 40%, right? But again, these individuals are learning this from the comfort of their own home, and there's just a lot of things that we can't control about where their attention might be directed at any given point in time. And so maybe that's not that surprising. But again, the important thing is that the learning benefit is there. What we saw is that ADHD symptomatology was positively associated with the amount of task-unrelated mind wandering that individuals are engaging with, but it still works. So it didn't matter, irrespective of your level of ADHD symptomatology, we're still seeing the same benefit. The one thing that you might be thinking is, well, this is not a clinical sample, and so maybe what you're tapping into here, like maybe there's not that much variability in what you're seeing. Or one thing that really stuck out to us was that for this particular measure, there's a cutoff score. That if you go over that cutoff score, chances are you have a clinical diagnosis, and you should really go and follow up on this. 50% of our undergraduates met that cutoff. Prior work that used this measure maybe 4 or 5 years ago was around 20, maybe some got up to 30. We had 50. Something that Joe sort of brought up earlier, I think discussing with Svea of some of their work, is with academic accommodations. We all know, for those of us who teach in university settings, that over time those are increasing, and then with COVID, it's pretty high. And I think what Svea said earlier is part of what's at work, that there's a lot of destigmatization around. Maybe I do have issues with my attention, and it's okay for me to go get it checked out. And but 50% is quite a bit. And when we look at our academic accommodations at TMU, before COVID and after COVID, the amount that are related to an ADHD diagnosis is skyrocketing. And so we think this is just in and of itself is something that we're interested in following up with. But I think the one thing I just want to leave you with is that despite the fact that many of our students seem to have difficulty sustaining attention and learning for extended periods of time, and there's something that we need to be thinking about there, that learning benefit from interpolated testing is still coming out. Okay. All right, and so just to conclude, I'll just mention a few future directions that we're thinking about. So the first is, again, just sort of further testing the generalizability of what we've been doing here. And we've been doing this in collaboration with Jason Chan at Iowa State University, Dawei An, one of his graduate students, and Himjot Gill here at TMU, where we're not only looking at the effectiveness of interpolated testing in university students, but we're also working with community college students in Canada and across the United States. And one reason why NSF, who is funding some of this work, they wanted us to do this because in many community college settings, those students are much more likely to be interacting with video recorded materials compared to university students. And so the question was, is it going to work with we really want to make sure this is working with students who are definitely interacting with these materials. And we're doing more to expand the topics. So we're not just looking at psychology, there's physics, there's ecology, economics, and what we're finding across the board is that regardless of the population or the topic that we're working with, that interpolated testing does sustain a high level of learning over extended periods of time. Now, as good as that has felt for us, that at least when we go out into the real world, that something's happening here, these are still psychology experiments, right? And what if we wanted to incorporate this into our actual classroom? Are we going to see benefits there where students might be a little more motivated to do well in learning these materials than someone who's just doing this for credit or for pay? And that's one direction that we are going. And there are some folks in the Netherlands who have adapted this in a real world course and demonstrated that incorporating interpolated tests into video recorded or in-person lectures can be beneficial as well. And then the very last thing I'll mention is just some issues that we sort of keep coming back to, and we're always trying to figure out what is the best thing that we should be doing here. And that has to do with two things. One is time on task. One of the things that we sometimes hear back is, okay, well, interpolated testing is working, and that's great, but let's say I have a 40-minute lecture that I now need to interpolate with test questions, but I want to keep it at 40 minutes. So I'm going to have to drop about 10 minutes of my content and in order to do this, and how can I do that? My students aren't going to learn as much as they would. And my counterpoint to that would be, and there was a really nice piece about this in APS several years back, is that I think one of the things that we sometimes do too much of in our courses is that we just throw too much information at students. We just think, oh, I'm teaching intro to psych for the first time, and I better cover everything here or I'm not doing my job. But I'm not sure that's the best idea, because when you talk to students about well, what do you like about the courses that you're taking, or what do you not like? I've interacted with so many students, and it sort of just ties into this piece in APS where it's like when I'm over inundated with information, it's just one thing after another, after another, after another. I don't want to learn anything else about this. It just they did not do a good job of teaching me. I'm not that interested in abnormal psych. There's other things that I can be doing. And I think it's important to think about that. It's not about how much we teach, but how we teach it, right? And maybe the more important thing is for every lecture we teach, what are 3 or 4 concepts that I really want students to walk away with, and how do I relate that to their own lives where they might spark some interest in them? Maybe that's going to be a more effective way to teach rather than just throwing everything I can at them. So I think this time on task thing, it's a very common response we get, but I think that it might, again, just cause us to think about, we know what the obstacles to learning are for students, and it's not just what can we teach students to do, but what can we be doing in terms of how we construct our materials and present our materials that can help our students as well. And then the very last thing is buy-in. Whenever I teach intro to psych, upper level cognitive psychology, when I started doing that, I would wait until, let's say, the 8th or 9th week when we get to memory, and I would teach students about study strategies. I'd say, now we're going to talk about some applied aspects of memory. Here's things you can be doing in this class or other classes that can improve memory. And every time, students come to me after lecture and why did you wait until week 8 or 9 to tell me about this? I could have, thanks a lot. I could have really benefited from this. And so right away, I switched what I did. And now whenever I teach, again, intro, cognitive, it doesn't matter. The very first day we meet, that introductory lecture, the very first thing we go over is what we're going to cover in the course and then study strategies. And you have no idea how many students will come back, not just that semester, but following semesters, and they'll say, not only did these things that folks in this world have been doing help me for that course, but it's helping me in other courses. And I think sometimes they're taught these things, but they seem to forget that they've been taught these things. So I think the more we remind them that here's what works and here's what doesn't work, I think it'll be good. When I get to interpolated testing, though, and I tell them, here's the work, and here's how it sustains attention, and here's how It improves learning over time. And then I'll ask them, if for this course, if I started testing you every few minutes, and it was part of your grade, or if it was for the video that you're learning from home, and there's going to be elements of your grade associated with that, would you take this course? And it's like, no, I'm not sure I'm going to take that course. And there's this idea of like, well, if we're going to be now testing them all the time, what are we going to be doing to their anxiety levels? And we actually have some work showing that engaging in AAA testing can actually lower anxiety about being tested because you get used to the types of questions you're going to be getting. But I think the thing that really makes me think about is that we can do all this work in the laboratory as cognitive psychologists that's going to give us confidence in, oh man, look, we've actually found something that's working. Again, we're interested in a very circumscribed part of learning and an obstacle to learning, but we're finding out something that's working. And we're really excited about it. But then we go into the real world and students are like, I don't want anything to do with this. And I think what we need to do is to do a better job of sort of interacting with our students and understanding, not just at a quantitative level about learning, but at a qualitative level about how are the things that we know help learning, how does that interact with each individual student? And what do we need to do to strike a balance between the research and the real world experience of how this is going to play out in the real world? And again, that's something that we're continuously thinking about how we're going to implement these things. So if anyone has any thoughts or suggestions, I'd love to hear it. And yeah, with that, I just want to thank you all for your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Great, thank you. So we do have time for questions. We'll start right here.
Thank you for a great talk. I have two questions.
Sure.
One is more specific. So I'm thinking about your non-testing versus testing, but it's also passive, like engagement with the information versus active engagement. So like, Joe has some studies about just exercising a little bit, maybe in between can improve. So is it that as long as you're doing anything active with your mind, would you predict that might help kind of give a border to re-engage with the material next, or is there something specific about testing that's important?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as we know, with the work that we've been doing, the testing seems to. So one common thing that is done is let's just give our students a break, and then let's give another break. And students are often doing something active during that break. They'll be checking they're checking their social media, right? Like we know what they're probably doing. But breaks don't work. We have a lot of data coming out showing that like giving a break is completely ineffective relative to testing. We haven't done anything that directly compares testing with something active like exercise, like just
or
get up.
Playing Tetris, right? Like something where they're responsible for engaging their mind. Yeah. So
my guess would be that it wouldn't work, but I think it's worth investigating, absolutely. And I'm sure that if it's not us, someone else will take that up for sure, yeah.
And then my second question is more philosophical. So given that you're running into this barrier of 40%, like maybe mind wandering, like why do we need to get rid of it? Maybe it's an important part of how the brain turns on and off, and it's because I could imagine that if you incorporated interpolated testing in your class and the students really engage with the material and learn it well, but then when they come to my class, I feel like they'll be exhausted. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so like there may be a cost to maintaining that high engagement that manifests after.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. So we have actually had some thoughts about if we do interpolated testing with one set of materials, how does that carry over to something else? And we haven't carried that out yet, but we've definitely been thinking about that. Your more philosophical point, I think, is a great one. Mind wandering I want to say there's different estimates of how often we engage with this, but it's somewhere around 10 to 30% of our day, our mind is not focused on the external environment. It's directed inwards on our internal thoughts, whether it's about our past, our future, what have you. And the human brain there is absolutely no way the human brain evolved to sit still in a classroom for 3 hours and listen to someone drone on and on about interpolated testing. That is not why. And so there are good reasons why mind wandering is happening. People who study this, we don't know exactly there's no definitive answer of why this happens. But maybe the last thing I'll mention is that it's not all bad either. We've actually done some work showing that with interpolated testing, we can direct mind wandering away from task unrelated thoughts, so what you're going to have for lunch or what you're going to be doing this weekend, and towards mind wandering episodes that are actually related to the lecture. It's just that the lecture has to lend itself to that. And when that happens, when people mind wander about things that are, so like, let's say it's a lecture about, health and things like that, things that like, here's like the top causes of death in Canada and the United States, and here's things that we can do to, make sure that we can sort of ward off heart disease and things like that. It's going to start to invite thoughts about, oh, I know people in my life who struggle with this. And when people mind wander about those things, it actually increases learning. So mind wandering, yeah, I know I sort of characterized it as like this evil thing that your mind is still doing, but it's not. There's probably a good reason it happens, and when it's happening in a way that's relevant. And so I think ultimately what we want to do is, as educators, what can we do in our classrooms to redirect those thoughts away from things that, lunch will still be there, but to get them thinking about the information that in a spontaneous ways and at a deeper level that's relevant to themselves.
Maya's question kind of reminds me of the question that you asked Elizabeth. Like, if everyone is sending these emails with growth mindset, does it kind of lose its impact? In the same way, if everyone's doing the right science of learning things that's more difficult to do, is that going to exhaust students? Like, if every single course is doing it the right way, is that a problem?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think those are things that we're going to have to sort of grapple with as we move forward.
Hello.
Hi.
My question sort of actually piggybacks on that response as well, which was about the idea that this is really measuring recall, which is often at the lower end of what we're trying to do in a classroom, or is at the lower end of what the goals are maybe in terms of, synthesizing the information or, actually application. So do you see ways of perhaps testing that or figuring that as a next step?
Others have already done it. Yeah, so there's evidence that interpolated testing not only improves the recall of what you had learned, but your ability to make inferences based on that information. The other thing that I didn't mention in the work that we've been doing that I just personally think is super cool, and so I'm just going to geek out about it for like 2 seconds. Interpolated testing helps to prevent proactive interference, right? So it's this idea that earlier information doesn't interfere with what you're learning later on. And so there's this idea that it's keeping it separate. But our goal when you walk out of that classroom is I want you to have an integrated representation of everything that I taught you. The really cool thing is that when we give those final cumulative tests and we apply measures of integration, or how well did you put everything together, the interpolated testing group blows the other groups out of the water. So it's helping you to keep it separate when you need to, but then it's also helping you to bring it together when you need to. And so what I think is really happening is that you end up with more flexible access to the information that you've been exposed to, and you can do with it what you need to at any given time. So yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't want to say that we're the only ones who've been thinking about that, because there's some other groups in the US and Europe who've shown some really nice results around that as well.
Hi, thank you very much. Enjoying your presentation.
Thanks.
You mentioned near the end that when you were talking to your students, if I gave you a test for your marks throughout the lecture, would you still like to take this class, etc.? Would there be a difference between that kind of high stakes testing throughout the lecture, where the students know it's going to count for their grade, versus lower stakes where it's for your own learning and your own benefit?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. We haven't addressed that in our own work, but that's definitely this idea of striking a balance between what we're finding in the laboratory and how we take this into the real world, and what is going to be that sweet spot of students are going to buy into it, but it's also going to work. And so we have it, but there's a lot of, in the cognitive literature, there's a lot of great work that's been done by folks like Alan Castell and others on value, directed remembering, not just when people think something has more value, they do a better job of, let's say, paying attention to it and remembering it. How we apply that to the tests, are they worth something, are they not? And for ourselves in the context of this paradigm, that's something that that's definitely on the list of the next things that we need to figure out, especially before we start to roll it out into our actual classrooms. Yeah, if we do that. Yeah.
Hi. Just to put it into context, in Ontario, the statistic is that 4 to 6% of adults have ADHD.
Mhm.
So when we come to a number like 50%, that's like
Yeah.
a huge.
And I don't want to say that that's a clinical diagnosis, but it's with that measure, it's indicative of you should probably
Yeah. So do you
follow
think
up,
that
yeah.
like with social media, with TikTok, with Twitter, like everything is becoming shorter pieces of
Yeah.
information? Do you think as a race as a whole, do you think that we're adapting differently to this kind of quick information?
Yeah, that's a really good question that we've been thinking about this for quite a while. Yeah, I think that's probably part of it, and it's not just us who've been thinking about it. So I mentioned earlier massive open online courses. When that research was starting out in 2012, 2013, folks at MIT did these like large scale studies with just hundreds of thousands of participants where they varied the length of videos and tried to see like at what point are people losing their focus. It's about 6 minutes. After 6 minutes, and so the reason we're using 5-minute segments, that's not like completely arbitrary. There is something about that, but this could vary from culture to culture potentially. I remember I once gave a talk about research related to this in Denmark, and there was someone in the audience from the medical school at the local university, and they asked like, well, their first comment was like, well, in our country, we know that here in Denmark, like our ability to sustain attention fizzles out at about 40 minutes. And I was like, 40 minutes? Like, what are you all doing here? Like, because the research that we're seeing from North America, it's about 6 minutes, and you start to see a dramatic drop off. And I think, yeah, the development of, what you see with social media and just this idea that it's just like very short things that, and I think we all experience this, right? When I go on, let's say, a sports website, and I want to see, I'm like, oh, I have a few minutes before I have to do something, and oh, here's a highlight I really want to see. I turn on the highlight, and it's like, oh, there's a 10-minute. I'm like, I don't have time for this. It's 10 seconds. It's like, oh, how much is 10 seconds of my life? I can just ignore the commercial. I don't do it, right? And I think we all do something like there is something about this idea that we just want what we want much quicker, and I think that does maybe feed into what we're seeing. Yeah.
This will be our last question. I know there are a number of people who
Sure.
have questions, but this will be our last question before the lunch break.
That's a lot of pressure. I just actually wanted to go back to the statement over here about like the increase of it. One of the things also that I've been seeing is that there's a lot of, as you said earlier about the destigmatization
Yeah.
of the neurodiverse situations, there's more people seeking out help. And there's that large population of people who may suffer from that inattentive kind of version of it, that because you were able to get through school when you were a child and only have that one responsibility of being a child was yours, you got to go through until you get to a certain stage, and then it's like, wow. So
Yeah.
I could see definitely the social media, but also that destigmatization that allows people to go and not only seek help, but then grow a more supportive population that even makes it more so to say, you know what, maybe it's going to be even more. So that just came up as I was thinking and mind wandering.
Yeah. In a very good way, right?
Well,
Very
and that's
related, yeah.
and that's what this comment's about. Is that
Yeah.
because I also wanted to connect it to when you were talking about, maybe considering the amount of content that you have and prioritizing.
Mhm.
The other benefit that I can see is that when people are mind wandering about the topic, that takes time, right? So I might be, okay, there you go. I've exposed myself. So I might, several times probably. So I might be thinking about the topic and actually reflecting and going, wow, that's really interesting. But if that's like 5 minutes that I kind of miss, and you've crammed 3 things in that 5 minutes, I've missed 3 things. Whereas if there's a little bit more of a even pace that allows perhaps not only, like as part of the kind of strategy to work with mind wandering is perhaps somehow, I don't know if you could see the blank looks on your, on 50% of your classes' faces, maybe that's where that's one of another kind of like rationale for really reconsidering the content and the pace, which is ironic because my pace is very like
Right.
fast.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And as you were sort of explaining that, my mind wandered to something very, which is, by the way, is a really funny thing. When I talk to my students, is like, if you think your instructor's not mind wandering during class, you're mistaken. They're doing it too. But where my mind goes with that is this idea of like how much time we have to present things, and then if your mind sort of goes off on a mind wandering episode that is actually related, it might be useful. If you're watching a video recorded lecture, you can just rewind it. You can go back. When we're in the classroom, we can't do that. And the one thing that's making me thinking about a lot these days is that I know a lot of universities, there is a lot of pressure for, hey, we need to get our students back in class. We need to be lecturing back in class. They're paying good money for this. And I all valid points. But if we're just going to throw away these materials that we've developed, that, you know, if you talk to students, there's like, I love this. I can actually, if I go off on one of these tangents in my own mind, I can go back and I don't miss anything, right? And there's a lot of context that I've been sort of seeing where the idea is like, well, you can't make those available anymore, or it really has to be in person. But why can't we flip our classrooms in ways where, like, what we're doing here is having a more constructive conversation about what you had time to think about and mind wander about in good ways and digest before we. So I think that it just, your point sort of highlights, I think, a lot of different issues that we're going to need to grapple with as we sort of are. You know, there was so much work about how is COVID impacting learning. But now, what about as we come out of COVID, what are the implications of what we've learned and what we're going to take away from that? And are we going to actually learn lessons from it? Or are we just going to go back to the same old way of doing things that maybe it was better than everything being online? But, you know, I think we've learned a lot about what we can do to improve. So.
Thank you so much, Karl. And to